Good evening, everyone. I'm going to get us started. Welcome to the Annenberg School for Communication and the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communications 2018 Distinguished Lecture. CARG, the center, is designed to be an institute of advanced study that aims to produce world-class, field-defining research grounded in a vision of inclusive globalization that embraces bottom-up actors and the stunning diversity of global media, politics, and culture. It is also a meeting place or gathering place for discussion on these topics. That's an ambitious goal, and I know of no one more capable of succeeding on reaching it than its director, Marwan Crady. Marwan is the Anthony Shadid Chair in Global Media, Politics, and Culture at the Annenberg School for Communication here at Penn, where he is also affiliated with the Middle East Center. An expert in global communication and a specialist in global media industries, theories of identity and modernity, and political symbolism of the human body in the public sphere. He is also an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, one of the several prestigious fellowships that he has received over the years. Marwan has published 13 books and edited volumes, penned 130 essays and chapters, won 50 awards for teaching and scholarship, delivered keynote addresses and named lectures worldwide, and advised universities, civil society organizations, foundations, and governments. Notable books include Hybridity, or the Cultural Logic of Globalization, published by Temple University Press, Reality Television and Arab Politics, Contention in Public Life, published by Cambridge University Press, and among the more recent, his account of the Arab Spring, The Naked Blogger of Cairo, Creative Insurgency in the Arab World, published by Harvard University Press. He is also a frequent and insightful commentator on global media and issues of global media issues in various media platforms across the globe. I won't mention all of Marwan's accomplishments and awards, but I did want to mention that in 2017, he became the only scholar to twice win the Best Book Award from the International Communication Association's Division of Global Communication and Social Change, for his first for Reality Television and Arab Politics, and then again for The Naked Blogger of Cairo. And then in that same year, he became the first author to twice win the Roderick Hart Outstanding Book Award from the Political Communication Division of the National Communication Association for the same two books. I could go on, but I think you get the point. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marwan Crady, who will introduce tonight's distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Michael. It is with open arms that I welcome Professor Hector Amaya, the 2018 CARG Distinguished Lecturer in Global Communication at the Annenberg School. But before singing Hector's praises, I want to take a minute and mark the occasion that this is CARG's 5th anniversary, folding in the 2-year when it was CARG. And I want to begin by thanking our dean again and again. But this year I thought, since this is the last time Michael is dean for the distinguished lecture, I would like to show sort of a very brief reminiscence, if I can get to it. No. No, that's not for you. That's for Mexico. But I'm trying to figure out how to get. Sorry, Michael, it's insisting. I see. Okay.
Oh, great.
So I just thought. Okay. I'll show a few pictures of trips with Michael or official CARG events that he's been part of. And I want to begin by thanking my colleague, Professor Guoben Yang, who has been the sort of co-conspirator in lots of these trips and the instigator of several of them. This is a picture of, that's Michael staring at the barbarians through the other side from the Great Wall of China. Guoben is in the middle. This is a photo that Davan Shah calls the three amigos that he sent me. This is a picture also from our visit to Hangzhou a few years ago. This is a picture of Michael leading a bunch of us, including Jessa Lingle, Professor Jessa Lingle and Sandra Gonzalez Bailon and Kelly Fernandez when we went to Cuba. And this is Michael, as usual, giving us sort of the very nurturing but real advice and feedback. These are Marina and I at a very early CARG event. So that's that. And these are some other pictures. Michael and Guobin. Here, Michael is actually collecting evidence on top of the wall. And this is a more recent picture. So some of these pictures were taken by Guobin, others were taken by Kyle, and others I took. I just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you to Michael. Where's the CARG crowd? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, So Michael, as you know, he's been an absolutely phenomenal mentor to me and a resolute supporter to CARG. And I don't use that word it's a very common word in Arab politics, so I have an allergy to it. But Michael has been a resolute supporter of the center from the very beginning. And I can only hope that now that you're concluding your deanship, which to me, one of the big things about it is that you established Annenberg as a key player in global communication. You feel that this small project is on rock-solid footing. I feel that way, and it's thanks to you. So thank you. We have something for you, which is I know you get a lot of swag, but this is useful swag. It's a card bag with a expedition-grade T-shirt, a thermos water bottle, and international electrical plug. So if Michael's support and guidance were decisive for CARG establishment and growth, there was a second decision that has proven very pivotal, and that was bringing Marina Krikorian on board. Where's Marina? Hi, Marina. So I just want to say a few things. In those 5 years, Marina's portfolio has grown enormously. And it now encompasses a very wide variety of roles, including assisting fellows in all logistical needs. She's the managing editor of CARG Press, and as you see more and more publication coming out, you can imagine the kind of work. She's also the sort of general supreme caretakers of the CARG lemon trees. Michael, you get first dibs on the first lemon that matures. There are 4 of them. So, Marina, I want to thank you. I have something for you too, because Marina has been sort of a co-conspirator at CARG from the very beginning, and this marks her 5 years at CARG. So. I want to thank all the fellows who make CARG a very thriving and friendly place to be, sort of a mini competitor to this building. I will acknowledge that. I also want to thank everybody in this building who make all these events work and be successful. Corey, Julie, Ashton, Deb, Jamal, Andres, and Waldo are here with us, and Kyle, of course. So I'm not going to say too much about CARG, since Michael has already said quite a bit. I'm going to jump right into introducing our distinguished speaker. Professor Hector Amaya is Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia and a Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is not at Princeton University. He insisted, and I would like to remind people, but in Princeton, New Jersey, which are 2 different things. Previously, he was department chair at UVA. He was a visiting scholar at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. His work focuses on the philosophy of communication from a subaltern perspective. And his areas of specialization include Latin American media and film, transnational digital culture, comparative media study, and Latinx media studies. His current project, which he's working on at IAS in Princeton, New Jersey, Publicity's Other, Violence, Ethnicity, and the Undoing of U.S. America, examines new forms of violence, of harm, and aggression afforded by digitization, and evaluates them against normative ideas about publicity and intersubjectivity. Publicity's Other is Hector's 4th single-authored book. His other books, and I really recommend you read them. I've actually read every single one of them, more than once. His first book is Screening Cuba, Film Criticism as Political Performance During the Cold War, University of Illinois Press, 2010. His second book is Citizenship, Excess, Latinos, Media, and the Nation, NYU Press, 2013. And forthcoming with Duke is his Trafficking, the Violent Restructuring of Mexico and USA Publicity. If you recall, a couple of years ago, he contributed to a CARGC symposium, and he spoke from that book. So really looking forward to that. This year's distinguished lecture draws on Professor Amaya's latest book project, which is an ambitious endeavor to re-theorize normative understandings of publicness and intersubjectivity through the trope of coloniality, the Latin American trope of coloniality. He casts utopian discourses about digital media in new critical lights and contributes to our understanding of the experience of modernity beyond the global north, and hence the almost failed, Michael. Inspired by a US Joint Force Command report from 2008 that labeled Mexico a state in risk of, quote, rapid and sudden collapse, Amaya will use a discourse analysis of the concept of failed state, the polite way to say banana republic, to illuminate its troubling connections with violence and order. These connections show that contemporary ideas about orderly and failed states cannot be understood without reference to the genealogy of these political and economic orders, which are intertwined with the histories of colonialisms that itself rests on ethnic and racial ideologies. Hector Amaya embodies CARGC values in their most unadulterated form. His work is grounded in the Americas, but has global purchase and implications. He embraces critical theory while exposing its Eurocentric blind spots. We had an incredible masterclass with him this morning. His scholarship is transcultural, comparative, and inclusive, and more importantly, imaginative. It's impressive in range, ranging from Cuban film criticism all the way to digital culture. And I think he has achieved this trifecta of scholarly influence, which is theoretical and analytical rigor, empirical richness, and authorial voice. Hector, we welcome you back to CARGC, and we eagerly await to hear what you have to say. The floor is yours. We are at Annenberg CARGC on Twitter, and the hashtag is CARGC1819. Thank you. Hector, the floor is yours.
So now I'm going to go back to the, no worries about it. I saw you struggle for 5 minutes. So. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm honored to be invited by the Center for Advanced Research in Communication Studies, by the Annenberg School of Communication, and by Marwan Kredi, a scholar who I admire, and I share your, when I was listening to introduction of Marwan, by the way, Michael, I was thinking, wow, yeah, that is a person I want to be invited by, and introduced by. Thank you, Marwan, for inviting me. Thank you. And let me start by immediately noting that this work is not simply an intellectual exercise, but it is also, in my case, a sort of therapeutic exercise. Mexico, the place where I grew up, the place that nurtured me in every way, is in terrible pain. A complex and violent conflict between criminal drug organizations, the state, and increasingly paramilitary forces has killed roughly 200,000 in the last 10 years. Last year was the most violent, with almost 24,000 people killed due to drug violence. In 2017, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, a British think tank, argued that Mexico was second only to Syria in terms of fatalities. It is worth noting that up to 2007, when President Felipe Calderón, newly elected, declared a war against Mexican drug cartels, crime indices in Mexico had been declining. Critics have argued that Calderón's aggressive posture against drug criminal organizations undermined the delicate balance between cartels and between the state, between cartels themselves. And this is the context for my forthcoming book with Duke University Press, and the context for today's presentation. This is kind of a map in a slide. It's a complex presentation, and I figure that you would benefit from very quickly, at least, having a glimpse of it. You don't have to remember it. You will see it repeatedly throughout the presentation. In November of 2008, roughly 2 years after the violence had escalated with President Calderon's election, the Mexican political establishment shuddered. A report by the U.S. Joint Forces Command that had labeled Mexico a state in risk of rapid and sudden collapse. This report was part of the Joint Operating Environment document that is presented to the Joint Chiefs of Staff to plan ahead for future force development throughout the Department of Defense. It is not inconsequential. The report, reprinted in Stars and Stripes, reproduced an idea circulated months earlier by Stratford, a conservative think tank based in Austin, Texas. And the potential repercussions of these reports were worrisome, as the report recommended that if the Mexican state failed, the US would have to act immediately to avoid general chaos and violence. Any descent by Mexico into chaos would demand an American response based on the serious implications for homeland security alone. That recommendation could possibly mean greater US intervention in Mexico. The report generated a lively debate in Mexico and the US about whether it was proper to use the terminology of failed state to describe Mexico. Now, for the book, I performed a discourse analysis of the US debate carried in 3 elite news publications here in the US, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the USA Today. My study was also longitudinal. I analyzed the use of the term failed state in regards to Mexico since 1990. Today, however, I want to present to you basically the conclusions of this discourse analysis and elaborate on the genealogy of some of the key elements that structure the discourse. My goal is to have all of us reflect on the historicity of violence, and the cluster of concepts that help us understand it. And one last remark before we move into the body of the presentation. My analysis of failed state is also an analysis of its corresponding opposite, orderly states. The discourse analysis describes the deployment of a particularly powerful concept, one that, I argue, is centered around a poorly demarcated idea of disorder. And I want to point you towards the implicit assumptions about order within the discourse of failed states. And in doing this, I want us to delve a bit deeper into the political economy of the concept of order that implicitly and uncritically animates the discourse of failed states. What is the concept of failed states? First, as proposed by political theorists like Michael Ignatieff or Robert Rothberg, a failed state is one that cannot exercise control over its territory or perform the state's basic functions. Second, the particular state collapse engenders violence and constitutes a failed state in the Weberian manner through an inability to maintain a monopoly of the internal means of violence. Rothberg combines both common elements when he argues that a state is strong or is weak according to the levels of their effective delivery of the most crucial political goods. And he argues security is the most important political good the state delivers. Most academic definitions include these elements, making violence and territory the central cogs of the idea of state failure and ergo state success. Now, research on failed states is ample, but research on the discourse of failed states is actually surprisingly scant. There are a few consistencies, however, in the literature that I want to bring to you. Researchers have found that the discourse of failed states tend to legitimize interventions, unsurprisingly, and this legitimation happens by constructing a hierarchy between Western nations and institutions over states, Western nations and institutions over the states defined as failing. This hierarchical discourse is constructed through the idea of crisis, which becomes the powerful and ethical reason to intervene in the business of others. Researchers show that typically crisis is defined using Western notions of state success and that are both ahistorical and Western-centric. All of this is perhaps not surprising to all of us here. Last, the discourse of failed states typically uses a meta-narrative. a meta-narrative, for instance, colonialism or imperialism. And this meta-narrative normalizes the concept, the hierarchies, and the intervention. Given all of this, Mexicans were perhaps correct on sounding the alarm when an institution connected to the US military labeled Mexico at risk of failure. For having used the term failed state, the institution began moving the discursive and ergo the ethical and epistemic machinery of intervention. The debate whether Mexico could become a failed state happened in magazines and newspapers on both sides of the border. Here I concentrate on the US side and the newspapers I mentioned to you, which are three of the most widely read print and digitally distributed newspapers. And they are considered, for very different reasons, obviously, journalistic leaders that have the rare quality of having survived and even thrived in the age of digital distribution. My analysis of this publication shows that prior to 2008, the idea of failed states was used and referenced in Mexico exclusively in arguments about politics and policy failures. The mentions range from overall references about Mexico's as a failed state because of, for instance, environmental degradation, or immigration, or foreign aid, or chaotic cities. This broad, politically random spectrum suggests that in this period, the references had more to do with the general overuse of the idea of failed states and news than with Mexico's particular conditions and state of affairs. Things, however, changed in 2008 in two significant ways. First, starting in November 2008, the number of references to Mexico skyrocketed and stayed high for roughly 18 months. Second, instead of referencing political issues, post-2008 references were chiefly about criminal violence. Why 2008? Well, you know, in 2006 is when Felipe Calderón actually had come to power. And he won a highly disputed presidential election and started his presidential term with an immediate increase in police and military actions against the cartels. In the following months, military deployment against the cartels increased, but not without controversy, as security forces were embroiled in cases and arguments about corruption. The violence escalated throughout 2007, and in May of 2008, the private intelligence organization Stratfor released a report written by George Friedman, its founder, where he argued that the lack of security at all levels and the overwhelming drug violence in Mexico justified the question of whether Mexico was on the path to failure. On December of the same year, the magazine Forbes essentially rehashed the Stratfor report, basically adopting Friedman's argument and forwarding the same question. The debate on both sides of the border began at that moment. In Mexico, newspapers sought the expert and legitimated voices of Mexican intellectuals, like Enrique Krauss, Carlos Pascual, Luis Rubio, Jorge Castañeda, to critically engage with the issue. Now, by 2012, the debate had run its course. Perhaps the idea of Mexico's failure had lost its luster, but it is as likely, actually, that the news, important news in the US especially side of the equation, the important news was the Mexican presidential elections in 2012. Now, echoing previous research on the discourse of failed states, the US reports establish a binary opposition between US and Mexico and a hierarchy that justified intervention. These reports also casted their argument in terms of a crisis, violence, and lack of control over territory, that implied or explicitly stated that the reason for the crisis was in Mexico's internal politics and or weak institutions. And all of these corroborated previous research on the discourse of failed states, by the way. Yet, there is one significant difference on the application and use of the failed state discourse on Mexico. The type of crisis that justified intervention was criminal violence. This finding is particular to the Mexico's case. The failed studies literature is not typically concerned with crisis due to criminality. It is concerned with political crisis. Even in the Colombian case, arguments about Colombia failing were always connected to the power of the leftist guerrillas like the FARC or ELN that control and continue controlling huge swaths of the Colombian territory. although FARC and ELN were connected to criminal organizations, we know this now, there was an uprising that had the public goal of challenging the political legitimacy of the Colombian state. The Mexican case is quite different. I believe it's quite important, this difference. If the Mexican crisis is criminal, shouldn't those analyzing it focus on the nature and production of such criminality? Drug violence is a form of criminal violence. It's a form of criminal activity. It is not often politically motivated. Drug cartels do not want votes or territory. They want wealth, even extreme wealth. Let's not forget that the drug cartels, the drug lords have wealth in the millions, in the dozens of millions, and even in the billions. Except in places like Michoacán, where La Familia and later the Knights of Templar have tried to substitute the state and governmental institutions, most cartels in Mexico do not show a desire to take over the state or systematically challenge its legitimacy. Rather, cartels direct their violence towards particular political targets who try to stop their efforts, or they work to try to place corruptible politicians in locations of power who will support their economic and criminal agendas. The violence shapes politics, but it is not often politically motivated. The violence is evidence of a desire for wealth that can only be achieved through illegal means in this context. What difference does it make? Whether the failure or weakness that plagues a state is due to criminal activity, not politics. Are they equivalent? They seem so in the news reporting about Mexico. So I ask, what makes this equivalence possible? Or even better, in what discursive universe are criminal and political crises equivalent? An equivalence between criminal and political crisis is possible if their social effects are considered more important than the reason that for the crisis itself. If what we're looking for is chaos, violence, and loss of territorial control, Mexico was indeed similar to, for instance, Pakistan or to Somalia, okay? Yet Mexico's crisis coincided with the strengthening of the nation's political structures, an invigoration of its democratic commitments, and the welcoming of political pluralism. Thus, the debate about whether the Mexican state was failing was based on a very, very, very particular notion of politics and the state, one in which the state is simply defined in relationship to violence and territorial sovereignty. Forget about democracy, forget about justice, forget about equality. A successful state is an orderly state. It is this shallow definition of the state that allows violence to appear as an indifferentiated experience, making possible the equation of the very different conflicts in Mexico, Pakistan, or Somalia. This shallow definition of the state and of violence as the state's order originates at the onset of modernity, the point at which European feudalism was giving way to capitalism and to the political ideas that would constitute the early modern state. It is very clearly represented in Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which connected ideas about sovereignty, violence, and property that would become critical to theorize in the post-feudal state. I have, as someone from Mexico, I have a lot of sympathy for someone like Hobbes, He wrote Leviathan in an awful time, a time of upheaval, wars in the midst of religious conflict, unrest in Scotland and Ireland, and the question of the legitimacy of the monarchy vis-a-vis the Pope. In his quest to theorize peace, he proposed what many had before, that the state is only legitimate if it can eliminate violence. This is not unique to him. Many from Aristotle onward had proposed similar ideas. However, Hobbes put a twist on this proposal. He envisioned that the best way to reduce violence was contracts, which would act as a form of social glue in a sense. Contracts would provide the order required to govern. It would become the key element of peaceful social interactions. And Hobbes, order and violence are the fundamental dialectic constituting politics and the basis for the idea of a successful and or failed state. Hobbes' ideas are often associated with theories of sovereignty, and rightly so. But the reason he is taught in week 1 of classes of social contract theory is because his use of contracts, in a sense, expanded the privilege of sovereignty from the monarch to the citizen in the following way, okay? Just like the monarch would have the full control over its territory, contracts guarantee the individual would have control over their property. So if the Peace of Westphalia, which was signed 3 years prior to Leviathan, made possible that European states would have the beginning of an international system of law that would preclude invasion, within the Commonwealth, within the state, contracts would grant the same security to citizens. Hobbes is, of course, a very complex thinker, okay? He's not simply proposing at this moment to eliminate violence from society. Violence is actually needed to impose peace, and violence is thus monopolized by the state, as Weber and others have noted. The state, in fact, regulates violence. It regulates its distribution and its allocation, and the histories of gender, race, and colonialism attest to this troubling character of the modern nation-state. So on the one hand, the state exists to eliminate violence. On the other, the state uses violence to constitute order. These sets of concerns and political ideas had different manifestations in different contexts. In Mexico, after its independence in 1821, disorder was the norm. I'm talking here about the 19th century, which was full of conflicts, open warfare. There were clashes between, due to religion, between monarchic and republican groups, between democratic and conservative groups, between liberals and conservatives, between urban versus rural. Mexico had also to engage a war against the US and against France at different times, thankfully, and withstand the challenge of making a nation out of the vast territory that comprised Mexico, even after losing half of its territory to the US empire. Consolidation was achieved only when the military only when the military took power at the end of the 19th century, when General Porfirio Diaz took power and stayed on it for a few decades. It is only at this point that the state had a chance to monopolize and engage in governmental programs with the help of the armed forces. These programs included internal colonization of rebellious indigenous communities, particularly at both ends of the nation, the Mayans on one end, the Yaquis on the north. Hobbes' ideas loom large at the birth of the 20th century and cast a shadow over Mexico's modernity and liberalism. But let's not lose sight of the seminal connection between state and violence that I'm trying to bring to you here. In the Hobbesian logic, the strong regulation of violence is the most important political good the state delivers. When Mexico, ruled for decades by one single party, was economically on the rise and was mostly peaceful and mostly orderly, many Mexicans and foreigners believed that Mexico was a well-run and functioning state, not the most efficient one-party dictatorship of the 20th century. Mexico was perceived as a healthier state with the pre than it is after the pre with the drug violence. This is precisely evidenced in the use of the discourse of failed states regarding Mexico in 2008. Now, I turn to a different question here. What is the world-making capacity of the state's strong regulation of violence? As a scholar of race and ethnicity, I could answer this question in relationship to the violences the state enacts on its subjects, of course, or the violence that the state sanctions as legitimate. But today I want to try a different path, a different style of answer, one that nonetheless connects back to the histories of gender, ethnic, and racial violence. I want to continue reflecting on the political economy of order, because I believe that there is more to order than its recognition as a historically specific process. And I have two arguments to present to you about the genealogy of order in the West that I think are interrelated and I think are very important. The first follows Hobbes' ideas about contracts and locates order within civic life and social interactions. It is an argument chiefly about private property. The second argument reflects on order in relationship to colonialism, and property is also central to this argument. Given the importance of property to both lines of argumentation, I want us to consider the possibility that the political economy of order and Western political thought is fundamentally based on property, and that the genealogy of order is also the genealogy of property. Let's start our reflection on order, property, and citizenship by first noting that, starting in England in the 16th century, one could witness the right of sovereignty expanding from state to citizens. The right of the sovereign at the individual level were property rights, which became more socially meaningful as they became more common and as a transition of feudal property land arrangements gave way to enclosure and to private land ownerships. This started in the 16th century, and it accelerated in the 17th century when Hobbes is writing. But it is John Locke, not Hobbes, who reflects better in this evolving order. Locke, who sometimes is referred to as the father of liberalism, was writing roughly 20 years after Hobbes, okay? By this time, England was becoming a geography defined by enclosed parcels, spaces structured by law. England was also being shaped by proto-liberal politics, and it was also being shaped by colonialism. These different elements were at play in discussions about the nation-state in Locke's second treatise of civil government, in which he laid down ideas about property alongside basic ideas about labor. Locke was a champion of private property. Locke was also a champion of the commodification of labor. And in a sense, he was also a champion of colonialism. In the second treatise, he used the open and wasteful common spaces of the Americas as warning tales about the poverty that would ensue if England were to revert back to the commons, to nature. The commons to nature. Private property, he believed, was socially responsible, for it reproduced the personal incentives to enhance productivity, and thus it was the legal tool by which a state could meet and exceed its needs. And Locke, echoing Hobbes, the order principle was constituted through a web of contracts that made property the legal avatar for order. His vision has taken roots, of course. Legal theorist Carol Rose would argue that ours, which is modeled after the British, is a property regime. Since Locke, order between citizens has been often correlated to the ability of citizens to rely on a legal system that would help them protect their private property, first their land, and later anything that can be owned. Echoing Locke, James Madison famously wrote about this expanding order principle of modern governmentality in 1792 when he writes, I quote, "Government is constituted to protect property of every sort, as well that which lies in the various rights of individuals, as that which the term particularly expresses. This being the end of government, that alone is a just government which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own." For an order principle based on property to work, property has to be central to life. And Madison, echoing Hobbes and Locke, found no problem arguing for this centrality as he rhetorically made property an even broader concept that included material things, but also freedom, religion, our profession, and he uses the term our every right. Quote, "In its larger and juster meaning, property embraces everything to which a man may attach a value and have a right." End of quote. Madison pushed the metaphor of property beyond its traditional limits because in his argument shared by several Federalists, including Wilson and Webster, property acquired yet other meanings. Property is also reflected as a conception of individual liberty that saw in property the mechanism for social stability. This means the means by which liberty could be exercised in the public sphere. My point here is that in the centuries following Hobbes and Locke, the concept of property, which even in its polysemy was originally tied to land, expanded to include all material things that could be owned and traded, increasingly including a wider array of immaterial things such as financially conceived yet intangible commodities, and as Madison would have it, rights. needed for an individual's freedom in the public sphere, such as reputation and others. On this point, scholar Cheryl Harris has even convincingly shown that in the US American legal context, whiteness itself has been treated as property, from land to the things needed to function freely in the public sphere, even whiteness. Property became the logic of life and the central technique to secure order. Carol Rose makes a similar point when she argues that property became a type of narrative of justice and self-ownership at the root of law and social norms of public interaction. She notes the intermixing of the words property and propriety, arguing that there are substantive reasons to believe that the property regime has the goal of dispensing that which is proper and appropriate to keep good order in the commonwealth or body politic. Property anchored the citizen to the proper social hierarchy. Now, the history of these important metaphors, which I'm bringing to you because this is the genealogy that I am bringing to you. The history of these important metaphors, discourses, equivalences, and socio-legal practices tell us that landed property owned space, and the expansive property regime that defined first mercantilism and then capitalism share similar roots and traits, okay? Connecting back to bloody times, that 17th century, awful century, dreams of order became political theories and eventually normalized ways of seeing political realities. Connected through powerful and insidious metaphors, the political and legal concepts that sustain the state, land, and commodities have become part of our material civic lives, making them part of our economic and political identities. So today, when we seek and praise orderly societies, we do not often reflect on what that means. Why would we? The discourse of order depends, I believe, on a Hobbesian definition of the state that cannot be separated from the property regime and its injustices. Order is thus a fantastically rich and potentially dangerous notion, and it is from this notion that an expansive idea of crisis, expansive enough to accommodate political and criminal violence, discursively emanates. The dangers of the order principle, however, do not end there. A state order is a state success. Yet order has a political economy that Marx showed related to the evolution of property rights and the nascent capitalistic forms of enclosure in the British 17th century. This political economy, however, cannot be complete without acknowledging the colonial connection. For as it was historically applied to the Western political imagination, the order principle and the property regime were central to colonialism. Why? Because colonialism provided the material means and ideological means to institute order in liberal European states. Let me briefly expand on this. According to Hannah Arendt, the political economy of order is a never-ending cycle of property accumulation. And Hobbes, she writes, property is power, and order based on property necessitates more property to reproduce itself. The wars of empire, which in the 16th and 17th century were redefined in the European political imaginary, would serve to further justify more and more territorial expansion. But the property regime did more than justify present and future actions. It provided also the ideological and legal ground for expansion, colonialism, and genocide. We can easily see this connection between the property regime and colonialism and both Hobbes and Locke again. Both thinkers argue in behalf of a European subject distinctly capable of using property for the establishment of order. They did this partly by drawing differences between the European and the colonial order. In the same section in Leviathan, in which Hobbes argues for a common power that would end violence and war, he provides a short but vivid description of its nasty, nasty American alternative. I quote, "It may peradventure be thought that there was never such a time nor condition of war as this. And I believe it was never generally so over all the world. But there are many places where they live so now. For the savage people in many places of America, except the government of small families, the concord whereof depended on natural lust, have no government at all, and live at this day in that brutish manner, as I said before. End of quote. Now, his vision is not unique. In the beginning, Locke hyperbolically stated, quoting the Genesis. What a pompous writer. In the beginning, all was America. And with the rhetorical equation of America to chaos, he disqualified those social orders that did not use European concepts of property or otherwise resemble European social organizations. Subjecting the indigenous land and population to European property regimes was, in their imaginary, expanding order, establishing order. The European property regime also provided legal justifications and techniques for colonialism within the Americas, very relevant to Mexico. Spanish jurists such as Palacios Rubios and Matias de Paz argued for Spain's right to take over the property in the Americas using westernized notions of property hardly applicable to the American context. They argue that communities, and the Antilles in particular, had not formed what Rubius and de Paz call civil society, and could not be understood as owners of property, even if they lived there. The Aztecs and the Incas, whose empires were political communities based on property, presented a challenge. So Rubius and de Paz arguments resorted to declaring all Americans heretics and thus incapable of dominion, the right of ownership, including self-ownership, by the way. So based on the American ungodly state, Spain had a right, indeed a duty, to proselytize. And with the encomienda, Spain gained the right to dispossess. The whole edifice of colonialism of the Americas rested on the argument that political and hence also property rights could be held only by civil men and civil communities. Heresy precluded both natives from both. As you may also know, the English and the French used similar logic in their colonies across the Atlantic, arguing that the Native Americans were neither owners nor responsible keepers of the land. In all of these cases, by the way, the violent wars of dispossession that shaped the American continent were legal and indeed proper. European and later US behaviors as the property regime had instituted the basic rules of ethics and morality towards others. Mexico's independence did not mean a break from these traditions. In fact, Mexico served as a laboratory for the use of liberal, racist, and imperialistic ideas common in Europe. So when Mexico's internal colonization became the answer to the concretion of an orderly and governable state at the end of the 19th century, roughly, property was at the center of this project. Joshua Lunn explains it as follows, I quote, "The idea driving the colonization campaign was that rural Mexico represented a mass of bottled-up capital waiting to be liberated in the name of national progress. Colonization then referred to the recruitment of immigrants and nationals for settlement in, development of, unoccupied lands, either purchased by government or appropriated," end of quote. So what was happening in Mexico is more than an echo of Locke's ideas. It's almost verbatim, actually, what's happening. The history of the Mexican state shows that Lockean ideas of order that justify US imperialism against Mexico had also become common ways in Mexico and Mexico's own governmentality, which used the logic of order to justify internal colonialism. It is doubtful whether one can understand modern liberalism without acknowledging the central role of property to the modern liberal notion of the state and to the project of Western modernity itself. This happened at the discursive and ideological level, as I have been arguing, okay? But also at the material level. And let me actually very quickly expand on this. Now, processes of colonial extraction, of course, drove and sustain the European property regime from mercantilism onward. Eduardo Galeano writes a book called Open Veins of Latin America, where he shows the profound dislocation between the principles of order common in England and Europe and the colonial principles. Post-colonial historian Joseph Inicori goes further, showing how the English Industrial Revolution was furnished by colonialism in Africa and the Americas. At root were not only the processes of exploitation and extraction, but also the manner in which Africa and the Americas were brought into the capitalistic trade. From Madeira's sugar in the 15th century to the slaves needed to operate the sugar plantations, to the gold and silver that ultimately supported the colonial structures, trade allowed the growth of European wealth and populations, providing the material basis for industrialization and the rise of the modern nation-state. The issue here is not simply that plundering happened, but that the wealth extracted paved the way for and funded the property regime and the order principle. On this, economists Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson present one of the most persuasive arguments about European growth post-1500. Their economic analysis of Europe shows that Western European proto-liberal states such as England and the Netherlands, that were also colonial powers, used the wealth extracted to fund institutions that would secure property rights, and thus to broaden the segment of society, expanding the economic and later the political franchises. So colonialism and the property regime are thus the two most insignificant factors in Western European growth. And let us not forget that there is the England of Locke and Hobbes, okay, where the changes took root the fastest and where a new form of social order emerged. So I am hardly alone when I state that the political economy of Western order is the political economy of colonialism. Today, in the discourse of failed states, order seems to be simply the application of good economic principles, good law, good political leadership. This is what we read again and again, okay? But order has a political economy. It is quite costly. It takes time, and is often the result of state violence within and without. The political economy of order also includes the particular costs and political logics that today constitute the contemporary securitization of the state. Costs alone are very instructive here, by the way. In 2014, the Institute for Economics and Peace released their annual report that showed that Mexico spent in 2013 $172 billion fighting the drug cartels. $172 billion, that's almost 15% of Mexico's GDP. Their methodology accounts for military expenditure, homicides, internal security, crime, private security, incarceration costs, and losses to the GDP due to violence. In the United States, we are actually even worse, okay? Things are also terrible. Although crime rates have been falling for the last few decades, criminal justice expenditures alone have multiplied. Since 1982, the cost of the criminal justice system has gone up 700%, from $35 billion to $213 billion in 2007, making the US criminal justice system by far the most expensive in the world. The US, of course, spends roughly 50% of the world's expenditures in the military are US-based. If we add to these the already astronomical figures for the budget of the Homeland Security, which is roughly between 50 and 60 billion, depending on the year, the cost of civil courts, the training of lawyers, judges, clerks, police, and other specialists at the service of the courts or police departments, and the cost of the technological infrastructure, keeping it all together, sustaining order here in the US becomes a gigantic economic enterprise. Perhaps the question of why Mexico suffers so much violence should be followed by the question, can Mexico afford, or for that matter, Somalia, Colombia, Haiti, can those nations afford order? Let me conclude here by noting that I am troubled, in a sense, by my thinking, by my arguments. Most of my ideas about civics are shaped by the order principle. I'm an orderly guy. I follow the rules. Yet the history and discourse of order reveals that order is tied to the particular contextual conditions of 17th century England: mercantilism, the rise of capitalism, the expansion of property rights, and colonialism. So, however troubling, I brought you this counter-history of order because I believe it teaches us on how to interpret the public debate about Mexico's failing state. The US news institutions equated criminal with political crisis. And in so doing, they normalized profoundly ideological theories of society, politics, and people. These news institutions normalize the assumption that order is the measure of a state's success, a standard so low that it is considered pre-Enlightenment. After all, Hobbes is the theoretician of the absolutist state. More recently, we can find the same logic in the fascist state. It is an argument that betrays any commitment to equality, justice, and democracy. These news institutions also led us into shallow questions, instead of asking the tough questions pertinent to the nature of Mexico's crisis. When members of drug cartels justify their violence in terms of their desire to acquire wealth, using whatever means, their desire for wealth is never subject to critical questioning. It is taken as a natural, as part of being modern human. We may criticize the means that narcos use, but not their goals. The goal is, after all, shared by most of us, isn't it? It is the central ingredient of advanced capitalism and neoliberalism. Is it natural, I ask? Is it natural to desire wealth like this? No. This desire has a history in a political economy, and some of it is explored here under the notion of the property regime. Is it surprising that the desire for wealth is treated as equivalent to the desire for justice, however misguidedly, by the FARC or the Hizbul Islam or the Zapatistas? It is not. It is not surprising in a US political ecosystem in which this therefore order justifies the massive growth of the carceral system and military expenditure. I sometimes think that Hobbes is kind of weeping on his grave, you know. He saw a serpent biting its own tail, an Ouroboros. He saw a world of religious morality destroying itself and attempting to disrupt the cycle. He imagined peace based not on morality, but material basis. The Ouroboros, impervious, continued recreating itself. An order based on property, as Marx, Arendt, Wallerstein, and many others have argued, can only normalize greed and invasion. But we are fools if we think that we can do anything to disrupt the cycle if we cannot even see it. We can do nothing if we are blinded or desensitized to the historicity of the absurd desire for extreme wealth that drives the current Ouroboros and that drives our social, economical, and political systems. Thank you. Perfect. Please identify yourself. Thank you, Marwan. Yes. Hello.
Hi. Thank you for this great presentation. I'm Amaya. You met me earlier. Yes. I'm a postdoc at CARGC. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship that you see between this kind of Hobbesian discourse of order and a discourse of crisis that maybe anthropologists of the state have identified as a legitimization for intervention, and the humanitarian discourses of the discourses that legitimize the humanitarian industrial conflicts, for example. I mean, like, what, do you see these as connected, or are they not connected? And I guess if I can add a second question to that, is more political. That one was more theoretical, and my second question is more political. If you see, I wanted to see if we could like contextualize it in now. So if you see a difference in different political visions, so like Mexico's recent election, is there a vision of the state that is different from the current left, right? That addresses this crisis of the state?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, no. To the first question is, most of the time when the discourse of crisis is deployed from within the West, it is rooted on the same discourse of order that I am citing here. I think this is not to say that actually that scholars and politicians and agents on the ground who are talking about crisis are empirically wrong. In fact, they are often right. Mexico is indeed in crisis, by the way. That is not the question that I brought to you is not about the empirical assessment of Mexico itself. It's about the way that we go about thinking about this empirical assessment. Yeah. So I believe that actually that belongs to the same discourse typically, but crisis does not exist only in that discourse, and there's a lot of pushback against the discourse of crisis. There is more so than the discourse of order, by the way. In a sense, I brought you a presentation about order that is really old-fashioned. This is Marx 101 and plus political theory 101. This is old-fashioned in that sense. We don't think about it as discourse. That's part of what I'm trying to do. Now, the discourse of crisis, by comparison, has gotten more pushback, and which is exciting. It's exciting to see. And I think the pushback is rooted partly in the same troubling things that I'm discussing here today. Yes, and regarding Mexico, it is hard to tell what AMLO will do. He hasn't started his term. He's only a few weeks away from it. He is likely to de-emphasize the war on drugs, at least publicly. Part of the reason many believe Calderon got into trouble was because the way that he made it a center of his government, and the way that he introduced military operations, which were very misguided, and many believe in Mexico that he should have gone against the wealth. Am I not saying that here? I agree with that. I think there are better ways of actually going after the organized crime, and a police and order approach, police and military approach is actually very limited and likely to fail. I think AMLO is a wiser person than the couple of presidents we had since the beginning of the war in Mexico. So I think he's a very savvy person. And I think he is likely to do things that are wiser in that realm. I truly hope so too. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I was just thinking about this. It seems that you were saying implicitly that order is symbiotic between the cartels and the government. In other words, that the reason that the previous regime didn't have as many problems is because it allowed the cartels to do certain things and keep order. I mean, it seems to me that the cartels, aside from wanting to get rich, want to create order, because that's how they get themselves done. And it's hard for me to believe that if you started sucking their bank accounts, that wouldn't cause a reaction similar to if you attack them. So it seems to me that there's a structural situation here whereby the cartels say, we want order because we want property.
Yeah.
And if you give us that, we'll give you order and not disorder. And then the real issue is, what's the cost benefit for the larger society? And a cynical view would be to say, if they kill each other, what's the big deal? rather than, say, well, look how many other people are suffering as a result of that. And can you have democracy, however we want to define it, when you have that kind of symbiotic equilibrium?
Yeah. No, I think I think you're absolutely right, by the way. The cartels appreciate order. The ironies of history in the case of Mexico include that actually after the 2000, when the PAN came to power, I'm sorry, by the way, my voice is a little bit gone. I don't know if you can you still listen to me? Yeah, all right, awesome. I have water here, yeah. And so after the PAN came to power in 2000, in the year 2000, with Vicente Fox, Mexico changed enormously in terms of the people who actually run the country in general, not simply at the federal level, but at state and local levels. It also enacted transformations to our legal system, both of which had the unintended effect, I am very certain, of disrupting relations of corruption that were orderly and long-lasting that previously the cartels had with the mostly pre-government and power. So the transition to democracy meant indeed a disorder from the point of view of the cartels. So you are very right that actually, in a sense, what they benefit the most for is order. They just want to do their business, and the state gets in the way, and people get in the way, and the Americans get in the way, So.
That's the question I'm asking. If it's better, is it better to have a stasis where everybody knows the rules than to have what consider crisis or chaos? I'm not sure, which one is better. You seem to be implying that order is better than disorder, or no, that disorder is better than order. And I'm not.
No, first of all, I don't have a problem with order. I have a problem with the genealogy of order that these conversations enter into as soon as they start, by the way. So order for me, again, I am an orderly person. And I know that I'm laughing right now, but this is a serious question. But it is true. I am among other things, I'm an immigrant. I don't break the law, otherwise I go back to where I came from, okay? Well, it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like that, by the way. But the problem is not order. The problem is the way that order is constructed in this tradition, and there are many societies where organized crime is central to society. We exist in one. And we are in peace with that, For every ounce of cocaine, marijuana, and methamphetamines that is produced and distributed by Latin Americans, we have a buyer here. So the question I ask you is, do you think our way of being in order is better than Mexico's way of being in disorder? It is a difficult question, isn't it? No, I agree. And so for me, it's not actually fundamentally what order is. I understand the benefits of order. I'm interested, however, in the way that conversations go, and it is the way that we frame the problem, the way that we find actually Mexican institutions weak. They certainly are weak, by the way. The way that we actually then try to fix that by fixing institutions and dumping money into a military police operation that is endless at this moment, without actually trying to reframe ourselves from actually jumping to these measures without reflecting on what actually the problem is about, And the problem, in many ways, is the way that we construct our societies, the desires that we instill on ourselves, and the and the sense of deprivation that there is common in Mexico and welcomes, therefore, easy solutions, So, but no, I'm order. I don't have a problem with order. I have a problem with this order. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you said your empirical project goes over time, and I'm curious about whether you have evidence that the discourse has changed over time,
Yeah.
and that the policies that seem an outcome of that have changed for you.
You mean the discourse of failed states itself, but because my project deals with basically the rise on violence and the public culture around it. That is broadly the project that the book is about. In this case, the discourse analysis is simply from 1990 to the present. Is that?
Probably I'm asking a dual question. Is there change in that discourse over time? And is there evidence that, since you're looking at the discourse in the U.S. rather than in Mexico, does change in the U.S. policy reflect that change in discourse?
Yeah, I think the most significant discourse is 9/11. Change is 9/11, and the discourse of failed states and the use and application of its the way it's enacted in U.S. news and public culture here. The very concept of failed states is relatively new. It was not used much in the 80s. It takes really steam during the 1990s, and is transformed actually when 9/11 happens. And so we see a tendency towards changing the conversation of what failed states are, which is unsurprising. A lot of our ideas about security and state order actually changed after that. And so in that sense, there is that evidence. Our very conversations about drug consumption in Mexico have also changed over time. So that's another element of the question. Maybe I'm wrong, and I heard that also. But it has also changed, and now you have actually a lot of people embracing the possibility of legalizing more and more drugs. So it is interesting to also see the state and the people also in Mexico changing their views on the matter. And when the violence first began, actually, I had conversations with friends who were very nice people otherwise, but who had no problems wishing every narco to be dead. I found that really shocking, at the time. I still cannot believe my friends would say things like that. Now, they are more complicated, their conversations. So the public culture about it and the public understanding has changed. Yeah. I think people are reflecting more on where these things are coming from. One of the ways in which actually you address the problem I presented to you is through legalization. It is not at the discursive level, but it is actually at the way in which they are addressing the wealth-making capacity of illegal narcotics. Yeah. Sorry, I have to, yes. Yes.
So this is a tricky question that might be even a little bit stupid, but every time I hear, in the history of thought, it's kind of difficult to interpret ideas that were formulated in the, centuries ago, getting rid of our own sort of, it's easy to make anachronistic judgments. But my question, which is kind of a thought experiment, is if you were to review Hobbes before he were to get published, what kind of suggestion would you make to him and how he thought about these issues? Because you seem to be dissatisfied, and that kind of shaped the way we're thinking about the state as the monopoly of violence. And what kind of argument would you suggest?
Well, the way I think about Hobbes is so much filtered through the interpreters of Hobbes that I read. That it is hard for me to dissociate myself from actually that thinking. And first of all, I do. When I say that at the beginning I read Hobbes without reading about his life, by the way, which is I think is a mistake. I think you have to read about who he was, and I have a lot of sympathy for him. He had a complicated life, and he had the worst possible time to be writing about things that he cared about. So But the way that he came on the issue of sovereignty is probably the weakest aspect, and the reason he is considered, just like Locke is considered the father of liberalism, he is considered the father of the absolutist state. It's not a really nice parentage, so that would say, I would...
The monarchies, right? Like he was
Yes.
pretty revolutionary in his time, in a way, no?
He was, of course, and he was brilliant too. And he borrowed so much actually from others, and he belonged to these legal, social traditions that were not his own. They were century old in England. So no, he's both very creative and very studious. He learned a lot from others. Yeah, I don't know if this helps, but yeah. Yes.
This may be also a little bit of a strange question, but how do Mexican television dramas, cop dramas to the extent that they exist, deal with questions of law and order? Do they, and particularly as they relate to the cartels, do they talk about this in dramatic form? And what are the ways in which they deal with that?
Yeah, no, the most popular writing genre for telenovelas these days is the narco genre. And so we deal with it enormously well and complicated, most of the time from the side of the cartel members, by the way. Yes.
So what are the consequences of that in sort of popular culture discourse?
I think, I want to believe that at best they humanize the cartel members, and indeed, they are humans, and the telenovelas engagement also tends to be rather superficial. So something as, I know, a show like Narcos on Netflix, is already more nuanced than the regular telenovela that you would see either in Colombia or Mexico about the drug wars. So they dramatize and over-dramatize the violence. They typically and often place the central protagonist as a sufferer of sort of trauma. When they are women at the center protagonists, they will be raped, as in the first episode. So La Reina del Sur, for instance, is an example of that. But it is not the only. Rosario Tijerinas, also in Colombia, is another one. So there are narrative ways in which they actually present to us these people that one is tempted to simply consider evil, but they are humanized through the process of storytelling. I'm not saying they do a good job at humanizing them, but that it has that effect. Yeah. I saw a hand here. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Amaya.
Thank you.
Very thought-provoking in some ways. So I have a two-pronged question. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Sridhar. I am a research fellow at Tufts University.
Yes.
I just came to attend your
Oh,
here.
thank you so much for being here.
No, it was
Yes.
awesome. So my question was, there is a strong evidence coming forward, and there is a lot of conversation about how the desire for order, and particularly the desire to control the flow of narcotics in US is actually fueling more and more narcotic-related violence in Latin America and Mexico as well. So would you actually consider that the notion of order in US is actually fueling the notion of disorder in Mexico in some ways? And second question, which is actually sort of linked, I am trying to hypothesize about this, is like US itself in some ways declared that in 1823 itself through Monroe Doctrine that Western Hemisphere is its own field of play too. That no other, particularly the Northern America is its own field of influence. So to what extent do you think US administration thinks that Northern America is its property in its own way? So what would the American policies be if that is a concern, if that is still concern continuing right now?
Yeah, it is puzzling to me actually how on the one hand, over the history of let me actually go back to the first question and then I come back to the historical question in a sense. The first question is that the measures of police and military securitization that are the typical measures that we see throughout Latin America regarding dealing with organized crime and massive violence have very limited effects, So on the one hand, actually, the desire for more order is not the problem. It's the way that we go about actually thinking about the problem and the solution that there is a problem. And it seems to be almost unavoidable, that different governments will try this similar tactic and it continues being of very limited use. So that's to the first question, To the second question, on the one hand, I have in the book, I have a chapter where I actually talk about the undue influence of the U.S. on the way that Mexico's own policies regarding the drug cartels are enacted. And there is evidence of this, by the way. I use WikiLeaks, by the way, and I apologize. I know that some people actually find this troubling, but that's the evidence I have. On the one hand, there is that, okay? So there is a desire by the U.S. to have interventions in Mexico that are really distasteful and awful. On the other hand, actually, the U.S. has been concerned with other problems than Mexico, so much more, that I am sometimes puzzled about the way that our nations are not cooperating on these issues. The Merida Initiative, which was with great fanfare, Obama launched in order to cooperate to address the issue of drug cartels, promised, correct me if I'm wrong, promised $2.6 billion over so many years from the U.S. to Mexico to fight. And I just mentioned to you the quantity that Mexico has spent in 1 year fighting the drug wars. So this is not to say that the U.S. is not embedded in Mexico, trying to, the DEA, especially to fight the drug cartels. All I'm trying to say is that in some sense, I always feel that, that our interests always seem to be elsewhere. And it puzzles me, And when what we call the opiate crisis here in the U.S. began exploding, I thought this would mean that actually someone in Washington would try to partner more strongly with Mexico. But then we got Trump, So, I don't think this is a Mexico's problem. It's obviously our problem. The U.S. citizens are dying on the hundreds and thousands, actually, because of the crisis. And it'll take better cooperation between both governments to actually jointly do something about it. I don't think, and I'm not being, I'm not interested in thinking that Mexico should fix its own problems. I think Mexico's problems are Colombia's problems, are El Salvador's problems, are Honduras' problems, and are the U.S. problems, and they are the world's problems, And they have to actually engage multilaterally to try to solve them. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Zubaida. I'm an undergraduate fellow at CARG.
Thank you.
I don't know if I've developed my question enough, so if I'm not making sense, please let me know. But thinking back to the master class and the question of what can be done within, and I see that you're criticizing the discourse of order, but I'm wondering how much can be done within this discourse. After criticizing the holes in the discourse, how much more can be done? It seems like almost not a sustainable quest to just criticize this discourse of order. Is it possible for, what in your mind, what is a possible step next?
Yeah. No, I think the basic terms surrounding order have to change. If we think that order is a police military action, then we are already in trouble. Clemencia, you are here. I would substitute the word order for peace any day. And the achievement of peace in the way that Clemencia Rodriguez, hi Clemencia, develops in her work about the violence in Colombia, it is the best way to think about it. So order, the way that we are thinking about it, this is a very traditional political sciencey, policy definition of order. It's not all the order that we can imagine. Peace is orderly, isn't it? Yeah. So yet we don't talk about peace. We don't talk about peace in the same way that we should be talking about peace. So I think those are possibilities that are there. I think there are Mexicans who are interested in learning from the Colombian example to try to think about peace. And there is just a little space for them. Clemens?
Two comments. One, I think is an answer to your question too. I think that part of the problem with the notion of order, I think Locke is brilliant and Hobbes is brilliant. But like Edward Said says, we need to shrink these notions so that we open up space for other ways to think about order. I promise you, if you look at indigenous notions of order, they're not going to be tied to private property necessarily.
Yes.
And so, the connection between order and private property is something that was born in a time and a place, and it was good for certain things, but it doesn't have to be a universal. There's many other proposals on understandings of order that we need to examine, and I'm so excited by Latin America looking more and more at epistemologies of the South and producing knowledge from a global South perspective, and that's the whole point, is like to shrink everything that we inherited from Western Europe and open up space to other versions of order and the good life and peace and everything. And my second comment is about, obviously I have to talk about the telenovelas. So first of all, in Colombia we have been bombarded by the same that Mexico is right now. I think we are in la delantera. I mean, we have like 10 years or 20 years ahead of you, of Mexico producing these narco novelas. And there's a lot of discussion in Colombia, like, one more, no, please, not more. And a colleague of mine, a Colombian communication and media researcher, once said in a meeting like this, okay, so how many Vietnam movies did the US need to understand that war? And so, we're gonna need many more to understand what we went through. And what I'm seeing in Colombia now is very interesting, because we had a wave of narco novelas focused or produced from the point of view of the victimizer. But now it's like that reached a point of saturation, and now we're seeing, for example, La Niña, which is on Netflix, strongly recommended to everyone. And it's the point of view of the victim.
That's right.
So the main character is a 14-year-old girl, and she's on the point of view of the victim, or the rose seller, la vendedora de rosas, again, so we're reaching another phase. And we're going to need many more phases to understand what Colombia went through, because, we're still kind of in shock, right? So.
And the, at least La Niña, the central question is, what type of person does it take to survive the temptations and the forces that are pushing you towards illegality? And so it is exemplar in that sense, It is. Thank you, Clemencia. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you for this. So I was wondering, I know that your analysis of the U.S. media journalist discourse starts in the 90s, but I was wondering if you can trace any similarities around discourse of order between what's happening now and what was happening in the 70s, where the U.S. also wanted to bring order to Latin America. The context was very different. They were trying to fight communism, and it was very different. But if you think that you can trace similarities around that U.S. discourse about, like, we need to bring order to this region that is chaotic, that's like.
No, I haven't done actually a study on that would allow me to compare, but the Cold War anxieties definitely heightened different elements of the discourse of order in the U.S. that I'm sure probably we would find, and were we to do that study about the 1970s, the desire to influence Latin American societies. But I haven't done it, it's a good project.
Thank you, Celeste. Thank you. I'm afraid Celeste
Yes.
got the last question.
Oh, I
Thank
see.
you very much.
Yes, thank you.